Good day. Here we have the three interviews from Professor Francis Boyle. Enjoy.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro, joined today with a very special guest who has been making headlines recently concerning the coronavirus outbreak. Mr. Francis Boyle, who is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law, and is the man who drafted the U.S. Domestic Implementing Legislation for Biological Weapons Convention, known as the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, which was unanimously approved and signed into law. Mr. Boyle, thank you for taking the time to join me today. You are considered to be an expert on the topic and the man who wrote the book, so to speak. You have recently come out and stated that you believe that the coronavirus outbreak, which the corporate media is saying originated from a food market in Wuhan, China, is actually man-made and originated from a bioweapons lab. Now, as an expert, what has led you to believe this?
Well, thank you, Spiro. Sure. As a result of that work I did, I routinely monitor outbreak of disease for both humans and animals around the world, just to see if there's a biological agent at work, warfare agent, and usually the answer is no. So I did monitor this one, and it seems clear to me that it leaked out of the Wuhan biosafety level 4 facility set up by the Chinese government that is working on every type of extremely dangerous biological warfare agent you can consider. Indeed, the first case reported December 1 was not at that food center. That's just propaganda. As far as I can tell, it is a chimera, DNA genetically engineered together of coronavirus turned into SARS, which is already a biological weapon. And indeed, previously, it was previously reported that SARS had leaked out of that lab at least twice. It also appears to be genetically engineered to mate with the flu virus, which is why it is so infectious. And the Indian study appears to have HIV in there, the causative agent, genetic agent of AIDS. I think the Indian scientists were pressured to pull that article, but I did read it and saw the pictures, and it looked pretty convincing to me. It could be far more dangerous than that. I don't know, but it has gain of function activities. These BSL-4 labs, all of them here in the United States are involved in them, making it extra lethal and extra infectious. It can spread droplets for at least 6 feet. It travels through the air. So anyone coughing or sneezing with this can give it to anyone within 6 feet. A carrier can infect anywhere from 3 to 4 other people, and there's a 14-day incubation period. And during this time, people carrying the coronavirus are asymptomatic. No one knows if they have it. So they could be spreading around the disease for at least 14 days before they come down with any symptoms. So as of now, Spiro, that's my analysis of the situation. It's extremely dangerous.
Now, I think that many people who are watching this will already have an idea as to why, but I have to ask. Now, why is this story not on every major news channel? Why are we not seeing the godfather of the Biological Warfare Act, you, on the 5 o'clock news everywhere, warning of this very possible scenario?
Sure, there's a good reason, because after the anthrax attacks of 2001, I publicly blew the whistle on that this came out of a U.S. Government biological warfare lab. I gave an interview on Fox News in Boston. Then I gave an interview on a radio program in Washington, D.C. Then I gave an interview on the BBC. When you're on the BBC, everyone in the world hears what you have to say. And then someone gave an order, and I never gave another interview again on anything related to biological warfare or biological weapons on any of the mainstream news media anywhere. So there I am. I've been blackballed and blacklisted off mainstream news media.
Now, going back to the Wuhan, the bioweapons lab there in Wuhan, China, I have to agree it is certainly suspicious concerning that the coronavirus outbreak originally started there. As you stated before, that they do work on the world's most dangerous viruses known to man, bioweapons known to man. I also find it extremely interesting that the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, hosted Event 201, which was a high-level pandemic exercise simulating a global coronavirus outbreak about 6 weeks before the actual coronavirus outbreak did occur. Now, what are your thoughts on this, given the fact that the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the CDC from both China and the US participated in this exercise, in addition to vaccine manufacturers, big banks, and many others?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was basically a war game is what it amounted to. There's no question about it. That's what the so-called tabletop exercises are all about. And we do know that the World Health Organization is in on what's going on in China. This is a WHO specially designated research lab. So notice the WHO is specially designating and researching some of the most extremely dangerous biological weapons in the world. And the WHO is working hand in glove with the Chinese government, disseminating Chinese government propaganda, of course. You see, everything the Chinese government has said about this is a total lie. The first case was at least what was reported December 1, which meant infection occurred probably 2 weeks thereafter. We're putting it back into November. So at least mid-November, I'm sure the Chinese government at the highest level was alerted there was a problem here, and they lied and covered up since then and still have done so. And the WHO, I'm sure, knew too. They're working hand in glove with the Chinese government. You saw Tedros, the WHO director, over there in China with a big PR meeting with President Xi, and they're all smiling and shaking hands and yucking it up. And Tedros commended Xi for what a great effort he was doing here, knowing full well that Xi has been lying and covering it up from the outset. So you can't believe anything the WHO is saying. Likewise, the CDC has been up to research, development, testing of offensive biological weapons up to their eyeballs, going at least back to the early days of the Reagan administration, when the CDC and American type culture collection sent 40 shipments of weapons specific biological agents to Saddam Hussein in Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war, in the hope and expectation that Saddam Hussein would weaponize them and use them against Iran. Well, what happened was, after that Iraq war was over, U.S. troops went in there and blew up these facilities and contaminated themselves with our own biological warfare agents, which has a contributing factor to the Gulf War syndrome. So you can't believe anything the CDC is saying. NIH has been up to its eyeballs in all this gain of function, dirty biowarfare work. NIAID too. So you just can't believe these people. My advice is, people are going to have to go out and inform themselves over the internet with alternative sources of information, which is why I'm giving you this interview.
Which I do appreciate, definitely. Now, typically, personally, myself, and I've been asking this question, is, the media and the governments lie to us continuously. They've lied us into many wars, so why should we believe them here? Now, if this is a bioweapon, as you suggest, wouldn't the death toll be much higher, or is it safe to say we're just being lied to about how bad it really is?
Well, Obviously, the WHO is relying on the statistics given to them by the Chinese government, which are all lies. My guess is it's probably at least 10 times worse in China than what is being reported by the Chinese government, the WHO. As for spreading around the world, I regret to report, Spiros, I think we're just at the beginning of this. I really don't know. I can't say.
I understand. So, Professor Boyle, you have been, as you stated and documented, following these kinds of outbreaks for some time now. What are some of the noticeable similarities to previous outbreaks, and is there any difference as far as this current coronavirus outbreak versus the previous SARS or Ebola, or those things of those natures?
Well, again, Spiros, I regret to report. I think you really have to go back to the Spanish flu virus to find something this dangerous 100 years ago. That's the way it's looking to be now. I could be proven wrong, but I don't think we've seen anything this dangerous since the Spanish flu virus. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to spread all over the world the way the Spanish flu virus did, but I think, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure here, Spiros.
Well, as we've seen reported in the media, that the coronavirus has been reported to spread to dozens of countries at this point. There also has been reports, not in the mainstream media, about patents of the coronavirus. And what is your understanding or currently of this situation?
Yeah, I read the patent by the Purebright Institute. That's a British biological warfare operation there. There was a leak out of there for their hoof and mouth weapon that decimated the British cattle industry. They've patented it. I read the patent. I'm not a patent lawyer, but it seemed to me that this was offensive, dual-use biological warfare weapon. The way these things work is that first they develop the offensive agent with DNA genetic engineering, and then they develop the vaccine. It goes in that order. And it seemed to me, reading through the patent, they took coronavirus with SARS and then developed it as, and it's clear they used the word SARS in there, and it also is clear it was intended for human beings. And then they said they developed a vaccine for it and patented it. It was patented by the U.S. Government Patent Office. So there it is.
So if there's already a vaccine, why aren't we seeing this or hearing about this? And in addition to that, who stands to gain financially from this? I mean, I guess the pharmaceutical and drug manufacturers potentially stand to gain enormously, in addition to the already massive bio warfare research programs that are going on. Can you kind of give us an idea of actually how large these industries are and prevalent?
Yes, of course, Big Pharma is going to make a killing on this, pardon the gallows humor. As for the U.S. biowarfare industry, starting after 9/11/2001 and not getting into figures before then under Reagan and his neocons, which, by the way, support biological weapons and even ethnic-specific biological weapons, but starting as of 9/11/2001, the last time I crunched the numbers was 2015. It was $100 billion. Now, to put that into perspective, the Manhattan Project to develop the atom bomb in constant dollars as of 2015 cost $40 billion. So this is twice as much. And since 2015, again, without crunching the numbers, I believe you have to add in about $5 billion a year. So it's $120 billion offensive biological weapons program, dwarfing the Manhattan Project. Again, the last time I crunched the numbers, 2015, you had 13,000 so-called life scientists involved in this. I call them death scientists, doing hideous work just like Dr. Mengele did in knowing full well what they're doing. So, of course, the whole biowarfare industry has a stake in propagating this, and the pharmaceutical industry has a stake too.
Well, Professor Boyle, what is the most important takeaway from this outbreak to you? And do you have any advice for our viewers out there watching this and that are concerned?
Well, first, the United States government must, initiate drastic measures to contain this. Unfortunately, I think that the scientific advisors that President Trump has around him are all up to their eyeballs in this. And you saw yesterday President Trump congratulating President Xi on what a great job he's doing. I really don't know if Trump is getting proper advice on this matter because the people behind him, as I said, are all implicated in this stuff. So somehow someone has to get through to President Trump and explain to him how serious all this is. Second, all BSL-4 and BSL-3 laboratories here in the United States should be shut down immediately. There's no legitimate medical or scientific reason for any of them. Third, as to personal protection, last week there was an article by Lori Garrett in Foreign Policy. She's a science writer, not an expert, but she had a pretty good tips in an article she published on foreign policy. But of course, that was only for SARS. Now, this is SARS turbocharged. So I would start there for sure with that Garrett article and follow her tips.
I'll be sure to link that below. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Francis Boyle, who is the professor of international law at the University for Illinois College of Law and the man who drafted the U.S. Domestic Implementing Legislation for Biological Weapons Convention. Thank you very much, sir, for your time today. I look forward to speaking again. Hopefully, we'll have some better news, some good news to report here coming up in the near future. I try to stay optimistic myself.
Right. Well, I have to stay optimistic. I still think that if President Trump orders drastic measures here in the United States, we could contain this. But if not, it could get beyond our control. I really don't know.
Well, one final question, since you do reiterate the drastic measures for containment, we have been seeing some drastic measures coming, reports on social media about the lockdowns there in China, fumigating the cities, and I myself get concerned about government control, over control, or crackdowns that could be justified through something like an outbreak or a pandemic. What is your viewpoint on that aspect of? Is the cure more dangerous than the virus itself, so to speak?
Well, the fact that China is engaging in these drastic measures that we're all reading about, I think proves that they know full well they're dealing with their own extremely dangerous offensive biological warfare weapon. And they're trying desperately to contain it because it could produce very well the collapse of the Xi government and the communist system over there in China. I studied world history with the late, great William Hardy McNeill at the University of Chicago, a rival to Toynbee, and he published a scholarly book called Plagues and People, where McNeill pointed out that plagues have led to the downfall of governments and regimes and civilizations. The Black Death here set back Western civilization by centuries. So I'm afraid that's what's going on there in China. Hopefully it's not going to happen here.
Professor Boyle, have you ruled out the potential for sabotage? Could a foreign agency, intelligence agency, have obtained this coronavirus, made their way into China, into Wuhan, and released it, knowing full well that there is a bioweapons lab right there that would take the blame potentially?
I have not ruled that out. But as you're saying, it would be all covert. And so far, I haven't seen that evidence. So all I can conclude from what I've seen, is that it leaked out of that BSL-4 that has leaked before, at least twice on SARS. So that, to me, applying Occam's razor is the most likely explanation. I haven't ruled out, some type of covert operation, but since it's covert, I don't have that. Now, my guess would be, if it was covert, President Xi by now knows full well what happened here. I'm sure he's got, his top people looking at this thing and figuring out, what it is and where it came from. So I guess we need to see what, if any, response there might come from President Xi to this matter. I can't say, but I haven't ruled it out. I did consider that. Indeed, that's why I didn't give interviews right away, because I was, dealing with competing alternatives here.
Well, Professor Francis Boyle, again, I appreciate your time very much. I think that it's important that we definitely get information outside of the mainstream media, of course, and people like you, experts like you, people who have been doing this for a long time, monitoring this stuff, being involved in this community. It's very important that you do offer these alternative possibilities. I myself, when I see things like this, my initial train of thought was exactly what we're discussing here today, because I never rule out any possibilities. I always try to look at everything from every angle while obtaining as much information as I can with an open mind and weeding out the blatant propaganda. So,
right, and the fact that I was the one who wrote the statute on the books that was approved unanimously by both houses of the U.S. Congress and signed into law by President Bush Sr., I've been completely blackballed off all the mainstream U.S. news media since the first week of November 2001, when I blew the whistle on Amerithrax. So that just shows you consciousness of guilt, that obviously there's something going on here. And if they're keeping one of the top experts in the country on this subject off the mainstream news media, of course, something's going on.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro, and I'm very happy to welcome back Professor Francis Boyle to the show. Professor Boyle is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law, and is the man who drafted the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention, known as the Biological Weapons and Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, which was unanimously approved and signed into law. Now, for those of you who may have missed our previous interview, I encourage everyone to watch it. Now, Professor, thank you for joining me today.
Cyril, thank you very much for having me on my best to your viewing audience.
Now, since the last time you and I spoke, there have been some major developments and bombshell studies that have just recently been published. Can you please tell our viewers what is the latest and the significance behind this?
Certainly. On Wednesday, I did give a 1-hour interview on this to InfoWars, and there is now a transcript out there you can find by Googling my name. Let me briefly go through that interview. I review 4 different scientific studies in the literature, professional literature. First, a DNA genetic sequencing of the Wuhan coronavirus by scientists in France and Canada, and their conclusion is that it has gain-of-function properties. As we've discussed before, gain-of-function properties is only useful for offensive biological warfare work, and it has to be done in either a BSL-4 or a BSL-3 facility. And we know that Wuhan is a BSL-4 facility, and it said quite clearly when it was opening up, it was there to deal with coronaviruses and SARS. SARS is a weaponized version of the coronavirus. Wuhan has worked on that before. There have been already reported 2 or 3 leaks from there, so I suspect that's what happened here. Second, then, and you can find all these scientific articles on the interview. is a scientific article reported by the scientist at the University of North Carolina. It is clear that if you just read through it, that they were engaged in gain-of-function DNA genetic engineering on the SARS coronavirus. Likewise, if you read the study, one of the researchers there was one of the top biological warfare experts from China, and that expert, I can't tell if it's a he or a she, but the name is there, was from the Wuhan BSL-4 facility. That's right on the scientific article itself. So it is clear that part of the technology here involved in this coronavirus came from that University of North Carolina lab. The last time I looked, it was BSL-3. Now, I had already condemned that lab before for doing gain-of-function work on MERS, Middle East Respiratory System, which is also a weaponized version of coronavirus. MERS is 33% lethal. The SARS is about 10%. And what we're seeing now with the Wuhan coronavirus is 15 to 18%, 15% by Lancet, 17% if you disaggregate statistics by the Chinese government, which are misleading on purpose, 18% by a British health authority. But it is clear then that there's a direct connection then between this Nazi biological warfare work at the University of North Carolina and Wuhan. It's just there and read it. So obviously this researcher took it back to Wuhan. The third article I discussed, again, scientific article, someone from that Wuhan facility also worked with scientists in Australia to DNA genetically engineer SARS together with HIV, which we've discussed before. And you have that Indian study with the pictures and everything saying that the current coronavirus involves HIV and SARS. Now, it appears political pressure was brought to bear on those Indian scientists. Prime Minister Modi there is trying to have good relations with China and President Xi. But I read that study. I saw the pictures. It's undeniable. So I think what happened here then. Oh, and by the way, that too, if you read the study, clearly a scientist from Wuhan was involved with the Australian scientists, and the Chinese government paid for it. So this is not a case of China stealing this technology. They bought and paid for it. They bought their way into it. So I think, Spiros, what happened then is that the people there at Wuhan took the technology from North Carolina and the technology from this Australian study and tried to DNA genetically engineer it together to create a chimera of three elements at least. The SARS coronavirus, the gain-of-function technology from the University of North Carolina, and then the SARS HIV technology from Australia to create a sort of a turbocharged biological warfare agent. We saw this with the swine flu. Swine flu clearly had three elements that were DNA genetically engineered together in a biological warfare lab. So I believe that is what has happened here. And indeed now, the final study I discussed, two scientists from China itself, and you can see the study there, concluded that this probably leaked out of that Wuhan coronavirus. So you can read those 4 studies, for yourself and draw your own conclusions. They're all there annexed to my the transcript. But certainly that was my conclusion. You'll also note that the North Carolina contract was funded by the National Institutes for Health and NIAID, the National Institute for Allergy and Infected Diseases. So they're up to their eyeballs in this. They knew exactly what they were funding, and they were funding it with Wuhan. And that is why then we are getting total disinformation, lies, and propaganda by Fauci, by the National Institutes of Health, by NIAID, this woman Les Monnier, if that's how you pronounce her name, and the CDC. I've also discussed with you why the WHO is lying about it and covering it up. So that, I think, is the importance of the interview I'm giving to you here today, to try to, cut through all this. If we're seeing all this mass confusion and pandemonium, it is because the highest level officials, certainly the United States government, the British government, the Japanese government, and others, will refuse to admit that this is an offensive biological warfare agent, because they're all doing the exact same thing. The United States, Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, I suspect Japan, Israel. So how can this properly be dealt with if the highest level officials of these governments are lying and covering up what is really going on here, let alone China, that's been lying, from the get-go. So that is my conclusion, Spiro, that it leaked out of this lab. They were working on this turbocharged biological warfare agent for offensive uses. Some lab worker got infected. This routinely happens at BSL-3, BSL-4 labs. Did not realize the infection, went out, did his or her normal daily activities there in Wuhan for maybe 24 days, 14 days. It turns out right now the reported that's not adequate quarantine. 24 days is now the estimate. That comes from Yale. And at the end of 24 days, came down with a fever, reported to a hospital there. No one really figured out what was going on here for a while. And by then it was just too late.
So, Professor Boyle, that is amazing information, and thank you for laying that out so clearly. Now, the 4 studies that you referenced of the Wuhan coronavirus states clearly that this COVID-19 virus is without a doubt weaponized and altered 100% for sure. Is that what your analysis is of this, Professor?
Yes, just read the North Carolina study and the scientists there from the Wuhan facility. And also just read the Australian study and the scientists there from the Wuhan facility. This is, direct connection right there. And then these French scientists and the Canadian said, yes, it clearly has gain of function properties. And as I said before, that's the telltale sign of a biological warfare agent, which is exactly what we know University of North Carolina was working on. They even admit it. They admit how dangerous it was. They admit they got approval from NIH to do it. And then they got more approval from NIH to continue to do it.
So now, Professor Boyle, now that we have this evidence and proof, the smoking gun, as you put it, multiple smoking guns, that the Wuhan coronavirus is in fact a bioweapon, does this mean that there would already be a vaccine potentially, since the virus has been modified or engineered? Wouldn't they have reverse engineered the virus? And if so, why are we not seeing or hearing about this potentially available antidote or vaccine?
Well, Spiros, I don't really know if there is an effective vaccine. What happens here all these BSL-3, BSL-4 facilities, what they do is, and we have 12 BSL-4 facilities here in the United States and maybe close to 200 BSL-3s. They go out and scour the world for the most dangerous pathogens they can find in order to weaponize them. Then they bring them back to these facilities and weaponize them with DNA genetic engineering, gain of function, synthetic biology, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Pentagon, etc. After they've then weaponized these, then they say, oh, well, we're really trying to make vaccines for the agents we've weaponized. But fine. So then they make the vaccines that may or may not work. That West African Ebola pandemic, I've already pointed out, that was produced by a so-called vaccine coming out of that Kenema BSL-4 lab run by the United States that injected those black Africans with live Ebola, and it set it all off. But even if they have an effective vaccine, which I sincerely doubt, those are the two components of a biological weapon itself. So it doesn't get them off the hook, because the two elements of a biological weapon are, one, the offensive agent to begin with, and then two, a vaccine so you can protect your own people. So they might have worked on a vaccine there. I don't know. They reverse engineer the biowarfare agent they have and then claim it's successful. But that didn't help over there in the West African Ebola pandemic at all. It was giving them live Ebola, and it set off that pandemic. So don't be deceived by this propaganda on this gain of function work or any of this other BSL-3, BSL-4s, all of which should be shut down immediately, that they're out there trying to develop vaccines. They're out there to develop weapons. They first DNA genetically engineer the offensive biological agent itself, and then they try to reverse engineer it to produce a vaccine. So that's really what's going on.
Professor, what are the enforcement procedures in the Biowarfare Act that you authored? Whose responsibility is it to enforce it? And aside from shutting down these facilities immediately, which I would have to agree we should do, what should be the process here for these are flagrant violations, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong.
Felonies and subject to life in prison. I put that in there. I was put under a lot of pressure by the Department of Justice to have the death penalty and also automatic wiretapping. I'm a civil libertarian. I felt that there should be a warrant from a judge and not automatic. But I had to throw the dog a bone there. So I said, okay, I'll give you the automatic wiretapping, since we're all wiretapped anyway, all up and down the kazoo, but you keep no death penalty, just life in prison. So that's what it is. I think all these people should be prosecuted there at North Carolina for this. Right now, Spiro, however, I think we're in a containment mode and a protection mode. Right now, that's what's most important. And unfortunately, this can't be done here in the United States because the highest level officials of the United States government are up to their eyeballs in this. Fauci, NIAID, NIH, CDC. So they're not going to come clean, and WHO. So I think the American people are just going to have to get organized here and protect themselves, because obviously the United States government is not doing it for them. Look at the State Department flying all those people back from Yokohama, and knowing full well that, they're contaminating. And I don't believe right now the 14-day quarantine is adequate. I think this Yale study should be 24. The North Koreans are saying 30. And they should know because they have their own biological warfare program there. I think that's what we need, but that is not what happened. So there's mass confusion, pandemonium out there, and the people who are supposed to be giving advice here to President Trump are up to their eyeballs in this stuff for quite some time. The FBI can't be trusted because they lied about, covered up, and destroyed evidence on Amerithrax in October of 2001. At the end of 2001, I called up the FBI, high-level counterterrorism official there, Spike Bowman, who I had met at a conference on international terrorism at the University of Michigan Law School. And after reading the technology there in the New York Times, which was, a trillion spores per gram, and it floated in the air, traveled in the air, I said this could have only come out of a United States government biological warfare weapons program, BSL-4, and probably Fort Detrick. I then called him back a second time because I had a list of all these programs and these labs. They were, at that point, they were a matter of public record. I went down the list with him, and then I said, and we know the CIA is involved in this too. And his response is, well, we're coordinating with Fort Detrick. And I said, well, Fort Detrick could very well be the problem here. Someone's on the reservation, is now off the reservation. Later on, it turned out it was Fort Detrick involved here. And at that point, then, the FBI went out to the Ames, U.S. government Ames anthrax collection in Ames, Iowa, and authorized its destruction. So at that point, I knew full well the FBI was in on a cover-up here and destruction of evidence. And then they proceeded to cover up ever since. First, they blamed one guy. He fought back, so they dropped him. Then they blamed it on Ivins and drove him to suicide. No one believes Ivins did it. The danger here is that anthrax lasts forever, so there is still a stockpile of super weapons grade anthrax out there somewhere. It could be at Fort Detrick, it could be at Dugway, it could be at Aberdeen Proving Ground. I don't know. But the problem is you can't trust the FBI. It's that simple. And so you're probably going to need local law enforcement to get involved in this. Maybe the state National Guard could be called up to deal with this. Or in terms of federal agencies, maybe the BATF or the Secret Service. But the FBI has a long history of lying, covering up, and doing damage control. So people are going to have to get organized on by themselves to protect themselves. They can't rely on the FBI, that's for sure.
And Professor Francis Boyle, you have been in documentaries, you've written several books, authored the Biowarfare Act. You definitely know what you're talking about. And you did blow the whistle on that anthrax attack on Congress back in 2001. And since then, you've been blackballed by the mainstream media.
That is correct, Spiros. What happened was after I called Bowman twice that same day, I was then scheduled to conduct a workshop on biological weapons with the Council for Responsible Genetics that I've been affiliated with since the early 1980s at Harvard Divinity School. So as I was walking into Harvard Divinity School, there was a Fox TV crew there from Boston. I said this had to have come out of a U.S. biological warfare lab and program. I then went in and conducted the workshop. I said the exact same thing there. Then I came home. This was the first weekend in November. Okay, so right after the terrorist attack, first weekend. Then I came home. I gave an interview to a radio station in Washington, D.C. Then I gave an interview to the BBC. So it went out all over the world. And then the hammer fell. No one ever interviewed me again in any mainstream news media source here in the United States, Europe, BBC, Latin America, you name it, on biological warfare programs and weapons, including Ebola, Zika, and other events since then. That's correct. So this isn't an accident or something. Someone gave an order that I was to be blackballed and blacklisted. That's the way it works, Spiro. So fine. That's why I'm talking to you.
And I do appreciate you taking the time to do so. And essentially, just to recap, in a nutshell, these 4 studies that just came out recently of the Wuhan coronavirus have been weaponized. These studies show that definitively by the Chinese with the help of the United States and funded by the National Institutes of Health. This is unbelievable. And Professor Boyle, any closing thoughts or?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me because we've been doing this for quite some time. That's why I drafted the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act. It was to deal with these Nazi death scientists here in the United States doing this Nazi biological warfare weapons work that I condemned for the Council for Responsible Genetics in 1985. You can find that on their webpage, where they asked me to run a briefing for Congress in Washington, D.C. on this, which I did do, and said it is time to have domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention. CRG asked me to do it. So yes. Now, one of the point I did want to address is, and you did bring this to my attention, were these military games that were taking place in Wuhan. I did look at that, and my conclusion so far, Spiro, and I did want to deal with it because it's going around the internet, is so far this is correlation but not causation. I started the University of Chicago as an undergrad, as a math major, where they had the number 4 math program in the country after Caltech, MIT, Harvard, and the University of Chicago. And I took Stat 210, statistics and probability for math majors, got an A. And one of the first things we learned is correlation is not causation. And likewise, I studied evidence at Harvard Law School. I regret to say I only got an A- there. But again, at best, this might be circumstantial evidence. What I have provided to you with these studies is direct evidence. I don't even know if that, could get admitted into court, but I have provided to you direct evidence and causation.
You're absolutely right.
And so for now, I do not go along with, the notion that this was some type of covert operation over there to sabotage China. I believe they were working on a turbocharged biological warfare weapon, probably in reaction to the fact that they knew we were doing the exact same thing, which you can tell there at the University of North Carolina. They had their own scientists there knowing what we were doing. So, and also, Spiro, I want to make it clear, I've never worked for the United States government as a matter of principle because of my opposition to the Vietnam War. I've never had a security clearance. I have no access to secret information or anything like that. I just read reputable scientific literature that's out there in the public record and then draw my own conclusions. I'm sure the Chinese do the exact same thing I do. Which is probably why they bought their way into that University of North Carolina program going on. And if you read it there, it's clear Wuhan made a financial contribution. They acknowledged they got money from Wuhan. You might ask, why do U.S. scientists do that? It's greed. There's no question all about it. And it's total lack of any ethical training by so-called life scientists. Here in America, the last time I crunched the numbers, 2015, we had 13,000 alleged life scientists doing Nazi biological warfare weapons work here in the United States, at least 13,000. So there's no ethical training there at all. All they care about is the money. And that's it. That's, so they can be bought, and they were bought.
And you are, in fact, a professor of law, of course, and as you stated, you have shown direct links, direct evidence showing that the coronavirus has been weaponized, and it looks like even the Chinese university did say that it likely came from the level 4 lab there in Wuhan. And when you say Nazi...
The Chinese scientists agreed with me, because as you know, I put out a worldwide alert, I think it was maybe January 24, saying this came from the Wuhan BSL-4. I have a list here of world media and also world web sources provided me by a public relations agency I've worked with. But again, no mainstream news media ever contacted me. When the big interview I did on this on that geopolitics came out, I also circulated it to these lists. Even I have an Illinois media list. They haven't contacted me. And then the transcript I just sent to you, I sent that out to. No one has contacted me. So it's clear that I'm on a blackball list. Indeed, to show you how serious this is concerning the West African Ebola pandemic, the late Congressman Walter Jones from, I think he's from South Carolina, contacted me on another matter, which we discussed. And Congressman Jones represents a big military base down there that was deploying to West Africa. Might have been the 82nd Airborne, I can't remember. And Jones is a conservative Republican, but he's a very powerful member of the House Armed Services Committee. So I said, now on another matter, Congressman Jones, I believe that this is a biological warfare agent that leaked out of that Kenema lab. It's a BSL-4 lab that was set up by Fort Detrick and USAID, and also by the Harvard MIT Broad Institute. They're all in there. And so your troops there that you represent are walking into an extremely dangerous DNA genetically engineered biological warfare agent. So Jones was quite upset, and he said, okay, I will have my top staffer get a hold of you, and you could work with him and try to sort all this out to get my troops protected. So an email was sent, and I responded on the email to Congressman Jones and his secretary and the top staffer, saying, here I am, I'm happy to work with you. I never heard from them again. Never. Obviously, someone threatened Congressman Jones, and he was a very powerful member of the House Armed Services Committee and a Republican. Who would have the power to make a threat like that concerning troops that he felt responsible for? And I never heard from Congressman Jones or his office again. Indeed, when Congressman Jones died, I sent my condolences to his office. There was no response. And I never heard from anyone in that office again. So I think that shows you what's going on here when it comes to blackballing and certainly keeping me out of the news media.
Well, and controlling the narrative, because they are unable to control the narrative when someone with your credentials is speaking truth and informing people. So it's definitely in their best interests to keep a lid on it, for sure. And when you say, Professor Boyle, when you talk about and reference Nazi experiments, you're not just saying that to be dramatic. I believe you're referencing Operation Paperclip, which was a covert operation at the end of World War II, where the U.S. snuck Nazi scientists over here and employed them throughout agencies and governments.
That is exactly correct. We deliberately brought in Nazis here, and they were, as you correctly point out, Operation Paperclip, all over agencies of the United States government that we really don't know anything about how many of them there were and what they were doing. But that is exactly correct. And my involvement in this. This is just Nazi type of biological work. And of course, not to exonerate the United States, because we looked into it during World War II, but we did not use it during World War II. Merck was involved in this right from the get-go. The National Academy of Science was asked their opinion on it about 1943, and they reported back, yes, it is feasible. And the National Academy of Science is worthless here, too. They're up to their eyeballs in biological warfare work, including DNA genetic engineering. So you can't, I've read reports coming out of there, you can't trust what they are saying. As a matter of fact, I don't think you can trust any life scientist who has taken money for biological warfare work from any agency of the United States government, because they're guilty here. They're up to their eyeballs in this stuff. They're only going to cover their own tracks. And so you've got to find outside independent experts, medical doctors, microbiologists. We have some here on campus, public health authorities who have not taken this money, and get proper advice from them as to how to contain this thing, assuming that can be done at this point. I really don't know, to be honest with you.
And for those that don't know, the U.S. has an extensive history of testing biologicals on unknowing citizens here in the U.S. as well, dating back into the 50s, which is a topic for another day, I presume.
That's correct, too, right. And if you're interested, the early history of the U.S. biological warfare, offensive biological warfare program is by Seymour Martin Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize winner. And he takes the story up to when Nixon signs the, pretty much, it came out about 1968, and it's all in there, everything. I keep it here for reference purposes. So Nixon signed the Biological Weapons Convention, but what happened, as far as I can figure out, is that the Pentagon and the CIA took it underground, and they never really gave it up. And finally, it did emerge into the public record, starting with Reagan, when I first tried to grapple with this problem and stop it. But as I said, if the U.S. government has been financing all this Nazi biological warfare work, then of course they're not going to prosecute it.
Absolutely right. Professor Francis Boyle, thank you so much for your time. I hope that you will add us here to your list of media contacts that you send out. And of course, you're always welcome back anytime. We look forward to having you back soon, as more developments are sure to take place.
Well, Spiro, keep up the good work, and please try to get this interview circulated all over the U.S. news media, all over the internet, so that the American people can act on it and understand they're being lied to by the highest level officials of the United States government. They're going to have to get organized here and protect themselves the best they can.
Well, that's absolutely right. Thank you for that. That's knowing that you're being lied to is the first step to doing something about it.
I'm here on your show to try to tell the truth as I see it, yes.
Professor Francis Boyle, thanks again so much. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Spiro. Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Spiro, joined today with a very special guest who I'm happy to welcome back for a third time to this program, and that is Professor Francis Boyle, who is a professor of international law at the University of Illinois College of Law, and is the man who drafted the U.S. domestic implementing legislation for the Biological Weapons Convention, known as the Biological Weapons Anti-Terror Act of 1989, which was unanimously approved and signed into law. Professor Boyle, thank you for being my guest today.
Well, Spiro, thank you for having me on again, and my best to your viewing audience.
Now, at the beginning of this outbreak, you stated that you believed the virus had accidentally leaked from the Level 4 lab in Wuhan, China, which is reportedly, of course, ground zero of the outbreak, Wuhan, China. Now, initially, we were told by the media and the government and the World Health Organization that the virus came from bat soup. Now we have President Trump saying that he has seen evidence that the source of the virus is the very same lab which you claimed it was in the very beginning. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, President Trump will have to speak for himself, but you are correct. I've said since January 24, that first interview I gave that went viral all over the world and has now been removed from YouTube, that this Wuhan coronavirus, which was unnamed at the time, was an offensive biological warfare weapon that had been DNA genetically engineered at that Wuhan BSL-4, which is China's Fort Detrick. It's the first Fort Detrick that China has set up. That's clearly what it is. President Xi there decided, he's been there, he decided he wanted to play with the big boys and set up his own Fort Detrick, and there it is. I won't go through, all the evidence since there, but there are two major developments since then that confirm what I'm saying. First, this French Nobel Prize winner in medicine did come out and say, yes, it was DNA genetically engineered with HIV right in there. And I pointed that out quite some time ago, drawing upon the Indian study and also the Australian Health Board contract with someone from the Wuhan BSL-4 Fort Detrick, that's exactly what they were doing. So it is nice to see that this French Nobel Prize winner in medicine, whom I do not know personally, is agreeing with me because, as you correctly pointed out, I was the only person in the entire world saying this, that it was DNA genetically engineered agent coming out of that Wuhan BSL-4. And then last weekend, it was reported in the Australian Daily Telegraph that they had leaked to them a memorandum, a 15-page memorandum by the so-called Five Eyes, which is the intelligence consortium of the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, confirming everything I said, everything. They mentioned in particular the University of North Carolina contract with Barrick and the Wuhan BSL-4 people. They mentioned the involvement of the Australia Health Board. They mentioned the involvement of Fauci and NIAID and NIH. So I think it's pretty clear that is what is going on here. What happened? Maybe President Trump, got a copy of that Five Eyes memo. I don't know. He hasn't, revealed what his evidence is. And I'm not relying on anything President Trump says between you and me.
Now, Professor, was this Five Eyes report published, you said, somewhere? Is there a way that we can see this?
I sent you the link to it. It was reported in the Australian news media, the Daily Telegraph, which is one of their leading mainstream news media sources there. And they had an extensive article on it summarizing the contents of this 15-page memorandum. That came out on Friday. And so Saturday evening, my time, Sunday morning, Australian time, I was live on Sky News in Australia discussing the significance of this memorandum that confirmed everything I was saying. So I rest my case. This was clearly an offensive biological warfare agent. It has it's been DNA genetically engineered, despite what everyone else is saying. It has been given gain of function properties, which means that it is more lethal and more infectious. And now we're finding out exactly that both those counts are true. It has HIV DNA genetically engineered in there, as that Indian Science publication pointed out originally, and now the French Nobel Prize winner in medicine agrees with me. And as far as I can figure out, it also involves nanotechnology, which is why reports are, even by this MIT scientist, that it can travel in the air for at least 27 feet. In other words, it floats on the air, travels in the air. It's not just spread by droplets. And the reason I reached that conclusion is that the chair of the Harvard chemistry department had his own laboratory over there in Wuhan. And it has been publicly reported that he had worked with Fort Detrick, and he was an expert on nanotechnology with respect to chemistry and biology, and that was what he was working on. So we also know that my dis alma mater, Harvard, was a sponsor and involved in China's Fort Detrick, along with the WHO and University of Alabama. So, ask yourself what, that on that one, I'm just putting two and two together, that I believe it does involve nanotechnology. So it's extremely dangerous and infectious. The lethality rate, they're, saying in public 5%. I have said from the outbreak, it is at least as dangerous as SARS. And SARS is reported in the scientific literature to be 15% lethal. This is SARS on steroids. And indeed, SARS was what they were working on in North Carolina, giving it gain of function activities. And SARS is a weaponized coronavirus to begin with. So we're dealing here with SARS on steroids. And last week, the Financial Times that I do subscribe to had an article, an analytical article, pointing out that, in fact, reported deaths understate excess deaths by 2 times. That is, you have to take the reported deaths, which are grossly underinflated deliberately on purpose for political reasons, and double them to get the actual or approximate number of people who are getting killed by coronavirus. And I noticed earlier this week, even Fauci said in his testimony the lethality rate could be twice what is being reported. So that is why I believe, Spiro, we are facing here an existentially dangerous biological warfare weapon that we have never seen before, at least released in public. The last time we dealt with a nanotechnology biological warfare weapon were the Amerithrax attacks in October 2001. And that clearly involved nanotechnology. It was 1 trillion spores per gram. I believe just like the Wuhan coronavirus, it travels in the air, on the air, very small little particles, and extremely deadly. And I blew the whistle on that in the first weekend of November 2001, including on the BBC, saying, well, obviously, this is a U.S. biological warfare agent that came out of a U.S. biological warfare program and lab, and probably Fort Detrick. Well, that's been confirmed too since then. So there we are, Spiro. I wish I could give, a more optimistic assessment of the situation. Now, just now before you called, I was listening to President Trump with his great initiative here on Operation Warp Speed. to create a vaccine. Well, warp speed, Scotty, beat me up. It reminds me of Reagan's Star Wars speech a generation ago. How can you develop a vaccine for an offensive biological warfare agent that is weaponized to begin with? The SARS coronavirus is weaponized, has been given gain of function activities to make it more lethal, more infectious, has HIV in there, and nanotechnology. We don't even have a vaccine for cancer after trying for an entire generation to develop one, and there isn't one. And I think that this is just a delusion by Trump, and he just appointed the head of GlaxoSmithKline in charge of his Operation Warp Speed, Scotty, to head this thing. Well, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, they developed a so-called vaccine for the Ebola pandemic in West Africa that killed 12,000 people. That leaked out of the U.S. BSL-4 there at Kenema. It was also an experimental vaccine that actually gave the people Ebola. And the vaccine they developed, eventually they admitted was worthless and probably more dangerous than worthless. So I think what we are going to see, whenever these vaccines come out, will be more dangerous than worthless. They could give people the COVID itself, for all we know. I really don't know. Or a relapse for people who have had it. So there we are today. I think, but there's so much money involved that all the so-called life scientists and big pharma and the labs and the universities are hopping to it and out there developing this vaccine and then lying to the people and saying, well, we could have it for you by the end of the year. I mean, that's what the head, this Marcef Sloui from GS Klein just said. That's a bold-faced lie. It's outright propaganda. I think, regretfully, the best we're going to be able to do on COVID-19 or therapeutics, like we have done with cancer. And, after a generation of therapeutics on cancer, those fatality rates have been brought down significantly. In the meantime, I think we have to do what South Korea has done. I'm not saying China; they're communist dictatorship on steroids there under President Xi, but South Korea is a democracy, and they've had massive testing, continual testing of their population, and not this fake, phony antibody testing, which is a joke and a fraud to get people to go back to work, but diagnostic testing, contact tracing, quarantines, I would say at least 21 days, because we're not, the incubation period has been reported up to about 27 days. And then follow up and medical treatment for those who need it, and all free of charge. I think if we do that here in the United States, follow the example of South Korea, then as we're seeing, South Korea is slowly opening up, but now they admit they made some mistakes by allowing this fellow to, run around all the South Korean nightclubs. So, they have to track that down and start all over again. I think it could be possible, but Trump has made it clear that he's not doing anything that South Korea has done. So I can't say I'm overly optimistic here, Spiro.
Professor Boyle, I have some follow-up questions for you regarding, first of all, the numbers. A lot of people, including doctors, have come out and stated that, the numbers what they're seeing don't justify, this response of these lockdowns. We have seen, for example, initially the projections were based on computer models, which turned out to be inaccurate according to the numbers that we're seeing. And of course, these computer models turned out to be funded by Bill Gates, who has a very large stake in the vaccines of this program. So, Dr. Deborah Birx, who is on the White House Coronavirus Task Force and also sits on the board of a foundation that is funded by Bill Gates, stated that regardless of pre-existing conditions, if they believe that someone has died with the coronavirus, they're marking it down as a death attributed to the coronavirus. So basically, that would be inflating the numbers, and still, even with those inflated numbers, a lot of even other doctors are saying that they're not seeing that this is as bad as what they said it was, and therefore we should start to open up. And some people have even questioned, if the existence of a virus at all. How can we believe anything that the establishment tells us, who has been lying to us for so long?
Well, sure. Spiro, all I can say is the following quotation is from a book, Agents of Bioterrorism, Professor Jeffrey Zubai, professor of biology at Columbia, and it was published long before this current crisis. And on page 188, it says, quote, "The overall death rate of SARS patients is 14 to 15%, unquote. It's that simple. And he documents it in here. So again, that's the figure I gave at the beginning of this. And indeed, last week, the New York Times had a citation to a tracking organization that said that in January in China, the lethality rate was 17%. So I've been saying it was somewhere between 15 and 17%. I think this is, as I said, this is SARS on steroids. So I'm not saying it's going to be higher than that, but the scientific literature indicates it's 15 to 17%, right? And I've already dealt with the other figures that it was in the Financial Times last week that what really counts here are excess deaths, and you have to double the number of deaths you're being given. So I suspect here in America, then we're talking maybe 120,000 dead people as a result of COVID-19. But I don't think, indeed, even earlier this week, Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times said, the real death rate is probably the reported death rate is probably at least 20% under the excess death rate. So I just think they're playing numbers with these figures.
Sure.
And I'm not. I agree with you that computer model out of Washington, University of Washington, that was funded by Bill Gates. And you can't believe anything Bill Gates says. He's up to his eyeballs in dangerous vaccines. And indeed, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is a lawyer like I am, has demolished Gates. If you look at anything he's written on this and how dangerous all his vaccines are. And we know Gates is interested in population reduction. I mean, he's a eugenicist. So, but his footprints are everywhere here too, as you put. Birx, she's Trump's poodle. She believes in herd immunity. Herd immunity just is basically the Nazi philosophy of useless eaters that was condemned by the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946. And I said the same thing in an interview I gave to the British news media over there on Boris Johnson and his so-called scientific advisors, that they're operating under this principle of herd immunity. It's preposterous. There's not going to be any herd immunity. That deals with, even in theory, vaccines. It does not mean you let this COVID run through the population and kill off as many people as it can, and then figure who's ever left is going to be immune. From what we have seen, there's no proof that if you've had COVID, you're not going to get it again. Indeed, there are now studies pointing out you can get it again. So there's no such thing as herd immunity. But Birx believes in it. Apparently Fauci, Trump certainly does. Boris Johnson does.
Now, Professor, speaking of Fauci, you said that he stated recently that we should take the numbers that they're giving us, which are, according to Dr. Deborah Birx, already inflated, and then double those numbers. How can we trust anything that Dr. Fauci says? As you stated previously, he's up to his eyeballs in this, and he stands to gain from this. He also sits on Bill Gates Foundation, the board of advisors for the Bill Gates Foundation's Decade of Vaccine Initiative. So, to me, major conflicts of interest there. You have exposed how Dr. Fauci has been, dealing behind the scenes in a lot of this to begin with. So, I mean, and how do we explain the hospitals that are largely empty across the country and in other countries if this is such a deadly bioweapon?
Well, of course, I agree with you on Fauci that he's up to his eyeballs in this Nazi biological warfare death science work. He funded Wuhan BSL-4 North Carolina study, and his NIH funded the Wuhan BSL-4 for Dietrich. Think of that. Why they're funding for China's for Dietrich. So you're right. I would not trust anything Fauci said. I would say, though, that from a perspective of lawyer and a law professor, this is an admission against interest, namely that you can plead it against him. But I didn't just cite Fauci. I also cited this study, analytical study by the Financial Times last week, and then also the saying you have to double the reported fatalities, and then also the study that was quoted in the New York Times even earlier this week, that in China in January, it was 17%. So I think that's correct. As for reductions, well, yeah, there have been these mitigation measures telling people to stay at home. So it is not as bad as they thought it was going to be. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen. So, if that is correct, and I don't know, because if you look at the numbers, they're saying one thing, but the deaths keep piling up, Spiro. I don't know how you can deny that. The deaths keep piling up. It's as of today, I think it's 88,000 reported. So I think you could double that to have probably, in accordance with the Financial Times, to get the true figure. And I'm afraid that's what we'll be facing.
Now, we know that the timeline has changed since the beginning of this, and that U.S. intelligence was tracking an outbreak in Wuhan, China, they claim, as far back as before last Thanksgiving. We've also seen reports that the military athletes who attended the World Military Games in Wuhan, China, which began on October 18th of last year, the exact same day that Event 201 took place, many of these athletes returned home and got very sick after the World Military Games. Do you find any significance in this new information about the timelines since the last time we spoke? And does it seem suspicious to you at all that we can now track the outbreak to around the same time as the World Military Games in Wuhan, China, where 10,000 military personnel from 110 different countries were around the world were all in Wuhan, ground zero, as this outbreak began?
Well, this is a case of correlation, but I'd like to see the causation. In my analysis that I have presented and has now been confirmed by Five Eyes, I believe it leaked out of that BSL-4. Whatever they might have had at the games, it could have been some type of coronavirus. I don't deny that, but I don't think it was COVID-19. And the timeline, as far as I can reconstruct it, is the leak there happened about November 1. The first reported case, I believe, was about November 15. That's the incubation period. And so, U.S. intelligence agencies probably figured it out by the end of November. was not paying attention to this last fall, I regret, because I was on sabbatical leave to write a book. And usually, I do pay attention to mysterious, unexplained outbreaks of epidemics to see if a biological warfare agent was at work. So I didn't pay attention to it until I resumed here for my classes starting just before the King holiday. When I read the report, I think it was on NBC, saying that there were severe pneumonia cases being reported in Wuhan. And I said to, friends of mine, I have a sort of a private biological warfare list we keep. Said, well, the question is there a BSL-4 there in Wuhan? And then I had to teach classes, so I didn't get back to it till the end of the week. And sure enough, there was. So I think it's pretty clear, what happened here. That, if those athletes had COVID-19, there would be no way they would be able to compete. It's like being hit by a bus. So they might have had something, sure. I don't know. But I think the direct chain of causation here goes back to that China's Fort Detrick. And it's clearly, this is China's Fort Detrick. We have to understand that. We cannot excuse it or apologize it or anything else. Certainly that's the way I see it. This is the first Fort Detrick that China decided to set up for itself and matching our own Fort Detrick. And we know full well that Fort Detrick here in the United States has always been involved in every type of hideous biological warfare agent you can possibly imagine. And they have almost never been involved in any legitimate scientific or medical endeavor that I am aware of. That's what Fort Detrick is all about. I think that's what China's Fort Detrick was all about, too.
Now, speaking of Fort Detrick in Maryland there, that facility was closed down by the CDC last summer due to contamination and leaks and failures of protocols. Again, that is very interesting. Some people have reported that there were some mystery respiratory illnesses taking place around that same time and in that same area. Again, these are, theories here, but you start to look at some of the pieces of the puzzle leading up to this scenario we have here. I would like to get your thoughts on that. And in addition to, do you believe that this is totally, an accident, or is there an agenda attached to this? And many people have been concerned about the lockdowns and the contact tracing programs that are now being rolled out and how they infringe upon people's rights and liberties and the destruction of small businesses in the middle class.
Right. Well, sure. All these BSL-4 leaks and the BSL-3s too. SARS leaked out of a biological warfare lab there in China, and they lied about it from the get-go and covered it up. I think they did the exact same thing here with COVID-19. So, yeah, something could have leaked out of Fort Detrick. There have been numerous leaks there before. But again, I don't think it's COVID-19, because we would have seen the pandemic there starting in Maryland and Washington, D.C. And we didn't. It clearly started in China. I still go along with an accident, because there have been numerous accidents before at these Chinese BSL-3s. And even our own Fort Detrick, which is supposed to be the gold standard, has repeatedly leaked. So I go along with an accidental leak somehow that China then proceeded to cover up and lie about, just as we have lied about our own biological warfare agents. Look at that Amerithrax, right? They lied about that from the get-go, even though I told the FBI this came right out of a U.S. biological warfare program, and probably Fort Detrick. And, they then went out to the U.S. government lab at Ames, Iowa, and destroyed all the Ames strain anthrax because you could have then done a genetic reconstruction. Then after several years, they blamed the wrong guy and they gave up on that. So then they blamed Ivans and drove him to suicide. So, and they're still covering up on that one. So the Chinese lie and we lie, sure. And about our own Fort Detrick and their own Fort Detrick. And if you read the accounts of that, whatever that leak was, I don't know what it was exactly, but of course they lie. They lie about all of them on both sides.
Professor Boyle, I know your time is short and you're very busy. I just have a couple last little follow-up questions here for you. So, the question is, regarding the vaccine. You've mentioned on this earlier, how could they possibly develop a vaccine for a biological agent that's been weaponized, as you state in these Five Eyes memos show? Then why are they mass producing this vaccine, hundreds of millions of dollars under this Operation Warp Speed, and they're talking about having RFID trackers on the actual delivery device with the Appiject company to where they can track and trace everyone who has been, where they were, when and where they were administered. I'm not saying they're talking about putting the chip in you at this point, but we also have seen the Department of Defense and DARPA funding programs with Bill Gates for a company called Inovio, for example, which does have nanotechnology in the vaccine. It does have, these are brand new, like RNA type vaccines, which have never before been used. And the regulations are rolled back under the guise of this emergency. And they're just rushing through hundreds of millions of vaccines that they're trying to produce and just mass give to, as Bill Gates says, he wants to give it to everybody on the planet. So are the vaccines potentially more harmful than was the cure worse than the disease at this point? I mean, this is concerning to me that the military is going to be distributing these vaccines as well here in this U.S. country.
Well, of course, you answered your own question at the beginning by the amount of money involved here, right, Spiro? We're just not talking about hundreds of millions. We're talking about billions of dollars being spent on this delusional endeavor to get a vaccine. So, of course, all the life scientists and big pharma salute and ship out because there's money involved. Whether you do or you don't, they don't care. It's just like the 13,000 life scientists who have been involved in the U.S. biological warfare industry after 9/11/2001. And that figure was as of 2015. I haven't looked at the current number now. So, of course, this is all about the money, Spiro. The so-called life science here in America have been completely corrupted by biological warfare because that's where all the money was. As I estimated in 2015, they put $100 billion in biological warfare, death science, dirty work. So, of course, everyone went into it, and they starved legitimate life science research. I was talking to two legitimate life science researchers here, and they said, yeah, it's almost impossible to get funding these days because all the money is going to this biological warfare work. And my estimate is we're talking at least $5 billion a year since then. So we probably talked about $120 billion. So that's what's at stake here. And then second, yes, you have all these totalitarians like Bill Gates jumping on top of this, and they will probably give us vaccines that are more dangerous than useless, but in any event can be used for the purpose of keeping us under control. I don't doubt that at all for a minute. And track us and trace us, give us passports, etc. And there's going to be meaningless anyway, whether we have these vaccines or not. So I agree with you that all these totalitarian charlatans and frauds like Bill Gates are jumping on top of this now to promote their own agenda. Right. I agree with that 100%.
Earlier you were talking about the Harvard chemist who was working and had an office there in Wuhan. Is this the same?
He had a lab there.
The
it
lab.
Wasn't just an office.
Right.
The Chinese gave him a lab. Right.
This was the same Harvard scientist or chemist who was arrested for espionage. Is this the same?
That's exactly right. Lieber was his name, chairman of the Harvard chemistry department and an expert in nanotechnology. And Harvard was a sponsoring institution of China's Fort Detrick at the Wuhan BSL-4. Why? The money. I have 3 degrees at Harvard. I spent 7 years at Harvard. I spent 2 years teaching at Harvard. They say their motto is veritas, truth, but the real motto is cupiditas, cupidity. Money talks and principles walk at Harvard. And it's always been that way since I entered there in 1971. So nothing's changed. And I believe the Chinese government identified Professor Lieber because of its skills at nanotechnology. And if you want to create a really lethal and infectious biological warfare agent, it needs to be based on nanotechnology. It aerosolizes that agent and aerosolizes in a way, this MIT scientist said it could travel 27 feet in the air at least. So yeah, and I'm sure Harvard knew all about this. Of course, they knew. They're lying. They didn't know what was going on. You know, they're not dumb at Harvard. Wherever you think they might be completely corrupt, but they're not dumb, and they know what they're doing. And money talks. I mean, look at the whole Jeffrey Epstein scandal. You know, Harvard was up to its eyeballs in dirty money from Jeffrey Epstein, and everyone knew that Jeffrey Epstein was a child molester. Didn't bother Harvard, didn't bother Larry Summers, whose wife got a $1 million grant, or all these distinguished scholars at Harvard. They were all prepared to deal with Epstein as long as he was writing checks.
Right, exactly. So the Harvard chemistry scientist, the chair there, you believe that I'm not sure what his current status is. If he's still arrested, if he's still in custody, which was his arrest legitimate? I mean, he was arrested for espionage. That's a pretty serious charge, and so he was playing a role apparently in developing this weaponized virus that we see, or at least the technology that may have been used.
Technically, he was not arrested for espionage. Technically, he was arrested and being prosecuted for misrepresenting his affiliation with the Chinese government. But I believe that was a cover story. That we also know that this Professor Lieber at Harvard was working for Fort Detrick, and so I think that's why the the U.S. Attorney's Office out there in Massachusetts covered this up. That they don't want the fact that some of this goes back to Fort Detrick. Indeed, if you read the University of North Carolina Wuhan BSL-4 article, they thank Fort Detrick for getting them cells. They didn't say exactly what the cells were, but they thank Fort Detrick. It's right in there. So, there's clear-cut causation here from Fort Detrick to UNC Wuhan BSL-4. But I believe that, China just didn't pay him all this money and pay for his entire lab and staff over there just to do scientific research and then put it in Wuhan right down the street from their own Fort Detrick. I don't believe that at all. No. So, if you want to believe in it, you could also believe in Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny. Just if people really want to believe that the most dangerous biological agent we've seen since the Spanish flu began because Chinese were eating bats, go right ahead. You're welcome to it.
Final question. You're very gracious with your time, and I know I do appreciate it very much. But we have seen some strange deaths not related to the virus, like several doctors, for example, supposedly jumping out of windows in places like Russia. Then there's the strange timing of this murder-suicide that took place, where one of the victims was allegedly about to make a major scientific breakthrough regarding the coronavirus. And then, of course, there was Dr. Frank Plummer, who was connected to the Chinese biological, espionage cases at the Winnipeg National Microbiology Laboratory. He died an untimely death of a heart attack, supposedly in South Africa. Is this all connected possibly in some way? I mean, I know this is just a speculative question here, but are we seeing something else tied to this and a potential cover-up take place?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there on potential cover-up. Yes, before all this happened. Indeed, before the West African Ebola pandemic that definitely came out of the U.S. government's BSL-4 in Kenema and killed 13,000 Black West Africans, there is a list on the internet, there was a list, it could have been purged by now, of about 28 microbiologists who died. And you can take a look at the list. And my guess is they were oft terminated because they knew too much and perhaps threatened to blow the whistle or were a leak. And they knew that the U.S. government, Britain, Canada, were involved in offensive biological warfare work that violated the Biological Weapons Convention, and here in the United States violated my Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989 that provides for life imprisonment. And that is why we're seeing the cover-up, certainly, because here in the United States, because people like Fauci and everyone else involved in this knows full well that they can be prosecuted for violating my law and can be subjected to life imprisonment. And the proof of that is the recent synthetic biology. Now, if you trace the history back of synthetic biology, which they say is the latest thing, you will find out it is completely funded by DARPA, which you also mentioned. DARPA was the one who financed this, set it up, and continue to finance it. It is synthetic biology, which also is involved. If you read the UNC Wuhan article, it clearly says they use synthetic biology. It's right in there, okay? And this was clearly set up by DARPA for weapons purposes. No, DARPA is not there for the benefit of humanity, right? Show me anything they've done for the benefit of humanity. It's like saying Fort Detrick is out there for the benefit of humanity. Even common sense can tell us that this is a lie. Okay? So at the very first conference of the so-called synthetic biologists, they produced a report with recommendations. And what was one of the primary recommendations in the first report by the synthetic biologists? That the United States government repeal my Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989. Why? Because they all knew they faced life imprisonment for using synthetic biology for biological warfare purposes as funded by DARPA, which they have done, as we can see in the UNC Wuhan BSL-4 article. And in my Biological Weapons and Anti-Terrorism Act of 1989, I had already anticipated them by making it clear beyond a peradventure of a doubt that it applied to synthetic biology. It's in there by name. So they all know that they run a risk of life imprisonment here in the United States. And so, of course, they're covering this up. There's no question at all in my mind. And that then, is why I've been completely blackballed out of the mainstream news media here in the United States, Britain, Canada. Although I was on the BBC to blow the whistle on Amerithrax during the first week of November 2001, but then they pulled the plug on me. I never heard from them since. That's just the way it works. Everyone knows they face life imprisonment, and maybe the American people will get around to it and demand that they be arrested and prosecuted. Right. And I'm happy to get involved in that.
Are you aware of any provisions, like something that may be within the Patriot Act or something like that, that may have sidestepped your law?
No, it's still on the books the last time I looked, and it's still in United States criminal code. It's been amended twice. When I drafted it, I made the mistake of assuming this was, I began working on that in 1985 when I first called for it at a congressional briefing that I held on the Reagan administration's biological warfare program in 1985, sponsored by the Council for Responsible Genetics. They were set up in 1983 in Cambridge, Mass, by Harvard and MIT and other life scientists, and then asked me to join to be on their subcommittee, later committee, on the military uses of biotechnology. So, yeah, I've been on this for quite some time, and so I drafted the most comprehensive piece of legislation I possibly could, but I made the mistake of assuming that legitimate life scientists would not get involved in this, which they did. We know for a fact that the Center for Disease Control, which is up to its eyeballs in biological warfare, Nazi death science work, and has been for the past generation, although I didn't know it at the time, an American Type Culture Collection, which is supposed to be an independent scientific agency, sent 40 shipments of weapon-specific biological warfare agents to Saddam Hussein in Iraq on orders of the Reagan administration to be weaponized for use against Iran. So my legislation was amended to put a registration requirement in there for so-called select agents. But other than that, it's still there on the books, right? Life in prison. And so all these people, these death scientists, Fauci, NIH, Francis Collins, the whole group of them, know full well that they face criminal prosecution. Indeed, after my legislation was approved unanimously by both houses of the United States Congress and signed into law by President Bush Sr., whom, by the way, I didn't vote for, I then put notices in leading scientific publications, including, if I remember, Science Magazine, read by all life scientists, saying quite clearly that if you get involved in this or continue your involvement, you face life imprisonment under my statute. Well, money talks, and I guess life imprisonment wasn't enough to deter them. What can I say? And they've gotten away with it since at least the start of the Reagan administration, when Reagan came to power, and under the influence of his neoconservatives who support biological weapons, that's clear in their PNAC report of 2000. They got heavily into the research, development, testing, and stockpiling of DNA genetic engineering for biological warfare purposes. And that story is told in my book, Bioweapons and Terrorism, by Clarity Press. I think it's around 2003. So all the documentation is in there if you want to read it.
Absolutely. And, after our previous interview, one of the viewers had sent a section of the Patriot Act. They're saying that Section 817 is trying to basically allows, let's see, it's right here. It's basically allows the sidestepping of your your law that you drafted it, and I'll have to send this to you. And I should have had prepared this and sent this prior to this, but to be honest with you, it slipped my mind until right now, until our discussion, and you reminded me of it. But it says that
I've read the Patriot Act, but I don't all of it, but I don't recall that particular provision. What does it say?
Section 817 of the U.S. Patriot Act. Here, this is a Global Research article. The United States has amended its biological weapons legislation via Section 817 of the Patriot Act and is now giving its own agents immunity from prosecution from violating the law. It says the United States has failed to report this change in legislation to the BWC, as it is mandated to do in a politically binding agreement. These weapons are reported to be secretly stockpiled in Sierra Army Depot in Northern California. And I will be sure to send you this.
I would have to read that because I did not recall it, the exact text itself. But I did read the entire Patriot Act because soon thereafter I was invited to be on a panel up at DePaul Law School dealing, for lawyers, explaining how totalitarian the USA Patriot Act was. There was a provision in there, maybe this is what they're referring to, permitting the president to waive the legislative requirement prohibiting open air testing of biological warfare agents. That was in there, if I remember correctly, but it's, the Patriot Act was 2001. But that doesn't, even permitting open air testing, which very well could have been done. And yes, they do stockpile biological weapons at Dugway, that's for sure. That's where all that anthrax came out of, all those anthrax shipments for sure. And that's stockpiled for biological warfare purposes. And, the Pentagon knew what it was doing. It was pre-positioning anthrax for use. They don't make mistakes like that at Dugway. So that could have been what they were referring to. I don't know. But that permitting open air testing doesn't, even if the president gave the waiver, and it wouldn't surprise me if Bush Jr. did, does not alter or amend the biological warfare of my Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act, at least the last time I looked at it, which I admit was a while ago, but I did look at it.
I just forwarded to you this Global Research article. Again, I apologize. That is my fault.
Well, I would have to read the exact text itself because, you can't really, with all due respect to you, you can't rely on what people in the news media are saying about statutes on the book. You really have to take a look at this thing itself. But I do agree, if I remember correctly, it did permit the president to waive the statutory prohibition on open air testing of biological agents. I believe that is in there, yes.
Professor Francis Boyle, I know you're an extremely busy man, and I can't thank you enough, excuse me, for the hour that you've spent with me here today. I know we probably weren't planning on being on here that long, but a lot of critical information, a very important topic, a lot of things to cover, and please feel free to reach out anytime. You're welcome on anytime, and I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you very much, Professor. Do you have any final points you'd like to make?
Well, Spiro, the final point I'd like to make is in the two interviews we've given so far, you have presented a very fair and accurate account of what I have to say, unlike all the other media sources here, mainstream media sources here in the United States. And that is why I have devoted this time to talking with you and giving you the best answers I can based on the evidence I've seen so far. to be sure, I'm constantly reevaluating this situation, but that Five Eyes report agrees with me and finally confirms pretty much everything I've been saying about this since January 24th. So, I keep an open mind. I keep listening. You have to understand, Spiro, that these so-called life scientists that come out and say, oh, no, like Ebright at Rutgers, who's quoted by the New York Times all the time. He's sort of the New York Times house microbiologist, that, oh, no, this wasn't bioengineered or this came out of the Wuhan wet lab. If you do a little due diligence research on them, you'll find that they're up to their eyeballs in Nazi biological warfare death science work, including Ebright, the favorite of the New York Times, no surprise there. He's on the board for the Rutgers BSL-3, which does every type of hideous biological warfare, Nazi death science work you can possibly imagine, including SARS. And in addition, he is also up to his eyeballs in every type of hideous Nazi biological warfare death science work at his own Waxman Institute, where he's the director. So you'll note all my opponents and my critics are on the payroll, and they're all involved in this, and they're up to their eyeballs in it. And I have been saying, for years that all their BSL-3s and BSL-4s must be shut down immediately. So they know full well, like Ebright and the rest of them, Gary, I could go on with the list, that if my recommendations are carried out, they are out of a job and their labs are shut down. They have no money, no funding, no people working for them, nothing. They have to go on unemployment insurance, and some of them can be prosecuted. So, of course, they've all ganged up against me now, except for the French Nobel Prize winner, Sir in medicine. And now Five Eyes is finally confirming everything I've been saying. But that's all the critics. Just do a little due diligence research on them, and that's what you're going to find.
Well, I have no doubt at all whatsoever the incestuous revolving door in this medical mafia and biowarfare program, cabal, basically. No doubt about it at all. And I thank you for your years.
Well, one other point. As for Harvard, if you read that UNC Wuhan BSL-4 article, one of the sponsors of this hideous COVID-19 research is listed as the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute at Harvard University, Harvard Medical School. I mean, please tell me, what does COVID-19 have to do with cancer? There's also, overlapping here between so-called cancer research and biological warfare work. And that article proves it, and also proves that Harvard is up to its eyeballs in dirty Nazi biological warfare research work, just as they were up to their eyeballs in Jeffrey Epstein money, the child molester, and they're still lying about it and covering it up today. So there you are. You have to, really do your due diligence research on all these people. No one paying me except, the people of the state of Illinois. I'm not anyone's payroll here. I'm not making money off of this. I'm just giving you my best opinion and advice as I see it as of today.
And Professor Boyle, I can't thank you enough as the man who did draft the U.S. Biowarfare Act. And please, when you do have time, in the future, I'd love to have you back on, especially after you get the chance to review Section 817 of the amendment of the Patriot Act and see what you can determine from that, and then maybe we can figure out how we can maybe get some of these people who are violating law to face the consequences and face the music. Thank you so much.
Well, okay, Spiro, please keep up good work, and you have given a fair and accurate account of what I have to say, and that's why I'm giving you a third interview here. Sure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor. Talk to you soon.
Sure. Thank you.